The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers, casting light over polished floors and elegantly dressed guests. The air smelled of fresh flowers and delicate perfumes, a celebration of love, or so everyone thought. I stood at the edge of the room, my hands clasped tightly in front of me, heart hammering against my ribs. My brother, oblivious to the storm brewing around me, laughed alongside his fiancée and their friends. I forced a smile, but it was thin, brittle, like fragile glass on the verge of shattering. From across the room I saw them, the group who had always looked down on me. Their eyes lingered a little too long, sharp with judgment. Their whispers reached me despite the music, slicing into my composure. "Did you see what she's wearing?" One said, smirking. "It's quaint in a tragic sort of way." Another added, laughter tinkling like broken bells. My face burned, and I tightened my grip on my clutch, forcing myself to stay still. They didn't stop there. Every comment, every pointed glance, felt meticulously calculated to belittle. "She's always so quiet," someone remarked, the words dripping with disdain. "Makes you wonder why anyone even invites her." My stomach churned, a bitter mix of anger and humiliation. I wanted to retreat, to vanish from their condescending eyes, but I stayed. My brother's happiness was at stake, and I could not ruin his moment. Yet every word, every mocking glance, dug deeper than any blade. I remembered the nights my family had endured struggling, rebuilding, and clawing our way back from a place they would never understand. These people, who thought themselves superior, had no idea of the history I carried quietly in my heart. They mocked the very resilience that had kept me standing. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I walked past the table where they sat, my heels clicking sharply on the polished floor, like a metronome counting the seconds until justice would come. Their laughter followed me, light and careless, as if unaware that the world could shift beneath their feet in an instant. Finally, I stepped into a quiet corner, away from the chatter, away from the scornful eyes. I clutched the engagement invitation, staring at the elegant script, and whispered to myself a vow that tasted like fire on my tongue. One day they will see. One day they will know who I am and what I am capable of. And when that day comes, my chest tightened with the promise of vindication. I straightened my back, inhaled sharply, and walked back into the crowd, a serene mask settling over my features. On the outside, I was the composed guest, smiling politely. Inside, however, a storm was rising, a storm that would not rest until every ounce of mockery and disdain had been returned tenfold. After the engagement, the world seemed quieter, as if laughter and mockery had left a hollow echo that followed me home. I closed the door behind me and let out a long breath, sinking into the familiar comfort of my study. The room smelled of polished wood and aged books, a quiet sanctuary where I could think, reflect, and plot. For years, people had underestimated me. They had laughed at my family's struggles, sneered at our modest lifestyle, and whispered that we were irrelevant, a shadow of what we once were. But they didn't know the truth. They had never seen the careful, deliberate way I had rebuilt what was lost asset by asset, investment by investment, until I had quietly amassed more than anyone could imagine. And now one piece of that empire sat closer than they knew, the estate. I walked over to the large map pinned on the wall, tracing the winding driveway and sprawling gardens with my finger. This was the place where my brother's engagement had been held, the very estate where their laughter had stung like 1,000 needles. They had danced, eaten, and toasted in my own property, entirely unaware of the irony. They thought they were among friends celebrating love, but in truth, they were guests in a home that was mine. It had taken careful planning to keep the ownership hidden. The estate was held under a corporate name, registered months ago with meticulous attention to detail. I had even overseen renovations, ensuring that it was flawless, elegant, and utterly unrecognizable from its previous state. Every corner reflected my taste, my vision, and my silent claim to what had once been my family's pride. And soon, everyone who had mocked me would witness that claim firsthand. I sank into my chair and let my mind wander over the memory of that night, the laughter, the whispers, the way they had leaned into each other, sure that I was powerless. A cold smile crept across my face. Power, I realized, wasn't about wealth alone. It was about timing, patience, and precision. They had underestimated me, but that mistake would be theirs to live with. My phone buzzed a reminder I had set weeks ago. It was time to send the invitations, to craft the next step in my plan. A casual gathering, I told myself, nothing extravagant, just a small post-in, engagement brunch to thank the attendees for their presence. They would come, unsuspecting, believing it to be a gesture of grace. But I had other intentions. I leaned back in my chair, letting the anticipation settle over me like a warm cloak. Revenge was not about immediate gratification. It was an art, and I intended to paint my masterpiece with care. The day would come when their mockery would return to them tenfold, not with shouting or anger, but with quiet, undeniable revelation. I closed my eyes, imagining the shock on their faces when they realized who had truly owned the estate. The thought was intoxicating. The fire in my chest burned brighter with every passing second. One day, they would know the truth. One day, they would understand what it meant to mock someone whose strength they had never seen. And on that day, justice would arrive, elegant and absolute. The invitations had been sent weeks ago, carefully worded to appear casual, gracious, almost indifferent. I watched from behind the scenes as RSVPs trickled in. Each acceptance a small victory, each message a confirmation that my plan was working. They believed they were coming to thank me for attending my brother's engagement, to share in the post-celebration glow. They had no idea they were walking into my carefully orchestrated unveiling. The day arrived, and the estate gleamed in the winter sunlight, immaculate and imposing. Guests began to arrive, exchanging polite smiles and measured greetings. I welcomed each one with calm composure, every gesture deliberate, every word light and charming. They laughed unaware as they had before. Their previous mockery still lingered in the back of my mind, fueling my focus. I let them settle in the drawing room, sipping on champagne and commenting casually about the weather, the flowers, the beauty of the estate. Then, with the gentlest of smiles, I let the first hint slip. "I'm so glad you all enjoyed yourselves at the engagement party," I said. "By the way, has anyone ever wondered who owns this place?" A ripple of confusion passed through the group. Conversations faltered. Eyes flicked nervously toward each other. I stood, letting silence stretch for a heartbeat before I moved to the desk in the corner. Pulling out the neatly stacked documents, I placed them on the table with deliberate care. "This estate," I said, my voice soft but carrying an unmistakable authority, "is mine." Gasps filled the room. A few guests laughed nervously, thinking it a joke, but the truth was undeniable. I handed out copies of the legal papers, watching as their faces shifted first disbelief, then shock, and finally, a dawning understanding of the irony. The very space where they had mocked me, laughed at my clothes, my quietness, my supposed insignificance, was owned by me. "I know some of you found amusement in my quiet ways," I continued, letting my eyes meet each pair that had sneered at me weeks ago. "But perhaps now you can appreciate the difference between perception and reality." My smile was calm, almost gentle, but it carried a weight they could feel in their bones. They fumbled over words, their mouths opening and closing, unable to form sentences. The room was thick with tension, the air charged with the humiliation they could not deny. Some offered awkward apologies, while others simply stared, defeated and speechless. Every emotion flashed across their faces: confusion, shame, disbelief, regret. I let them linger in the moment, knowing that this was the sweetest part of all the instant, when they understood that their laughter had fueled something far greater than they could have imagined. I didn't need to raise my voice or show anger. The revelation itself was enough. As I stepped back, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Revenge, I realized, was not in the spectacle. It was in the precision, in the subtlety. In the moment when they finally saw what they had never guessed, that I was not to be mocked, and that my strength, patience, and foresight had triumphed over their cruelty. And with that, the first seeds of poetic justice had fully blossomed. The room remained heavy with tension long after the revelation. The laughter, whispers, and condescending glances from the engagement party had been replaced by stunned silence. They shifted uncomfortably, some clutching their drinks as if the champagne could steady their nerves, while others stared at the documents on the table as if seeing them for the first time. I watched them serene, knowing that the humiliation I had suffered was finally mirrored back in a way that was neither cruel nor loud, only undeniably true. For a moment I allowed myself a quiet smile. Revenge had always been imagined as dramatic, fiery, explosive, but real satisfaction lay in subtlety. In patience, in letting someone discover the truth at the exact moment when it would hurt the most. They had mocked me, belittled me, assumed I had nothing, but now the weight of reality pressed on them like an invisible hand. Some of the guests stammered apologies. Others avoided eye contact entirely, pride battling with embarrassment. I met each gaze with calm, unshakable composure. My voice, soft but deliberate, carried across the room. You see, it's not always the loudest voice that holds power. Sometimes it's the quiet ones, those who work when no one is watching, who shape the world around them. A few whispered, acknowledging their ignorance, but I was not interested in public shaming. The lesson was already learned, the balance restored. The mockery had ended not with anger, but with dignity, elegance, and control. Then, in a gesture that surprised even me, I offered them a choice. You may continue to enjoy this estate, under proper arrangements, of course. I said lightly, but always remember that respect is earned, not assumed. This place is no longer a backdrop for your amusement. It is a reminder of what can be achieved when you underestimate someone. The subtlety of my generosity struck them differently than any confrontation could have. They realized that I was magnanimous yet firm, powerful yet measured. It was a balance they had never anticipated, in allowing them continued access, but on my terms. I demonstrated that revenge is sweetest when tempered by control. After they departed, I wandered through the estate, my fingers brushing the polished surfaces, taking in the familiar scent of flowers, wood, and success. This place had once been just a property. Now it was a symbol of resilience, patience, and triumph. I felt a quiet pride swelling in my chest, not only for the victory itself, but for the way it had been executed, clever, subtle, and complete. As evening fell, I looked out over the sprawling gardens, the last light of day catching the estate's elegant curves. The mockery had been silenced, my dignity reclaimed, and the estate stood as a reminder not of cruelty, but of strength, perseverance, and the quiet, undeniable satisfaction of having turned humiliation into triumph. The storm that had burned within me for so long had finally settled, leaving a calm warmth behind. I had not only revealed the truth to them, but, more importantly, reclaimed it for myself. And in that quiet victory, I realized the greatest revenge is not merely to punish, but to rise, stronger and unshaken, while others finally recognize the measure of your strength.